Hi guys, it's Mark Zicree, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Zicree of Space Command. And I'm going to be talking soon about a lot of stuff we're doing, some very exciting announcements and so forth. But for now, I wanted to talk about a friend of mine who sadly we lost very recently. And you may not know his name, but you will certainly have heard of his best known work. So his name was William F. Nolan. And this is a picture of me with Bill, if you can see that. There we go. He was a very, very, very dear soul. And he made it to 93, which is great, of course. And the way I first met William F. Nolan was when I was 21, I started working on the Twilight Zone Companion, which is that book behind me there. And Bill was... it was interesting. It was a very difficult time to write a book because this is before the internet, and so to find anything out, you either had to go to interview the people who had made the show, for instance, or you had to go to universities that had archives of various materials. You couldn't go online and find anything. And if there were some films you needed to watch, you had to get a 16 millimeter projector and put it on the projector and watch it. And so I'd met George Clayton Johnson, the great Twilight Zone writer of Kick the Can and Nothing in the Dark and A Game of Pool, and he also wrote the first episode of Star Trek that ever aired, The Man Trap. And so I met him when I was a teenager, and by the time I got to be 21, 22, I had this idea to write a book about the Twilight Zone. So he let me interview him. He connected me up with several of his friends who'd worked on the show, and I started interviewing people. And Carol Serling, Rod Serling's widow, this was only 2 years after Rod's death. Carol Serling gave me full access to everything at the house and in Rod's files and scrapbooks and so forth. But there was a lot that was sort of murky, a lot that was sort of unknown, and there were holes in what I was trying to uncover. And George Clayton Johnson said, well, you should talk to Bill Nolan. Now, one of the top writers on Twilight Zone had been a fellow named Charles Beaumont, and he wrote amazing episodes like Miniature and Perchance to Dream and Long Live Walter Jameson, just a phenomenal writer, and also wrote a movie, The Circus of Dr. Lao, that I was hugely fond of and still am. And so George Clayton Johnson had been part of the circle of friends where Beaumont was this charismatic center, this inspirational figure, this brilliant man. And it was a circle made up of some writers who'd worked on Twilight Zone, like O.C. Rich and John Tomerlin. They'd collaborated with Beaumont, and but Bill Nolan was perhaps Beaumont's closest friend, greatest friend, and another member of that circle was Richard Matheson, who by this point in the late 50s had moved out to California. And so these writers would hang out, they would pal around, they'd have parties at each other's houses, they'd drive at night and talk endlessly of books and short stories and movies and all these things that they loved intensely. And Beaumont was the core of this, but he died of pre-senile dementia in the 60s, in the late 60s, and he was only 38 years old when he died, and it was very tragic. And he started exhibiting symptoms of this when he was only 33. So it was a very tragic story. So Bill Nolan came over to my place, and he was an astonishing man. He was... Basically, the great thing about Bill Nolan was not only was he very articulate and very enthusiastic, but he had kept notes on everything and recordings on everything. And so he knew an enormous amount about Charles Beaumont and Ray Bradbury and all of these characters who were central to what I was working on, but also central to science fiction. And Bill Nolan brought me recordings of Beaumont on the radio. He brought me recordings of Beaumont when he was starting to fall ill and how his voice started to change and grow. What Bill said was grow more logy, kind of slower. And because Bill told me that when he would call Beaumont at that stage, he thought that Beaumont was just drinking heavily and didn't realize what it was until it was finally diagnosed. And Bill told me about how Beaumont started having his friends ghostwrite for him. For instance, Living Doll, which is the Talkie Teen episode of Twilight Zone, Beaumont and Jerry Soule co-wrote that episode, but only Beaumont was credited with it. And actually, Beaumont and Jerry Soule worked out the storyline, and Beaumont could no longer write scripts because his mind was failing. And so Jerry Soule wrote several scripts of the Twilight Zone that were only credited to Beaumont. So through Bill Nolan and through Jerry Soule telling me about these things, I was graced to write about them and publish them for the first time. And Bill Nolan just had this incredible enthusiasm. He loved Charles Beaumont, and he and George Clayton Johnson had been a writing team, they were just. They lived and breathed writing and science fiction and all of these things that I had enthusiasms for too. And so Bill was instrumental in allowing me to write the Twilight Zone companion. His information, and he sold the script to Twilight Zone, but it never got made. And so he would have been a Twilight Zone writer had the fates blown slightly differently. But early on, he actually collaborated on some books with Charles Beaumont. So they were also race car aficionados. So this was actually the Omnibus of Speed. This came out in the 1950s, and there's Beaumont and Nolan as the authors on the back. And Bill signed this to me, as did John Tomerlin, who's also featured in this book. One of their friends wrote Number 12 Looks Just Like You. And then Bill also, but Bill was writing prolifically. He's someone who never would have become a writer if not for Charles Beaumont's inspiration. And Beaumont, of course, was in his 20s and then his early 30s when he was inspiring all of these amazing talents to become writers. Beaumont was writing for Playboy, which was the top fiction market at the time. He was on a monthly retainer from Playboy, and a number of the articles he wrote for Playboy were actually written pseudonymously by his friends. And then at the same time, Nolan was writing nonfiction and fiction, and so he, for instance, wrote this great biography of John Huston, and of course Ray Bradbury had written the script for Moby Dick with John Huston. So as Nolan was a great friend and chronicler of Ray Bradbury, he came to know about stories about John Huston. So this is John Huston, King Rebel, and again, this is a book signed to me by Bill Nolan. And Bill Nolan fancied himself an artist, but he really wasn't much of one, quite frankly. But he was an incredibly charming man. So these were some of the early books he wrote, and some of the early credits he had. And then he also was managing editor on this short-lived science fiction magazine, Gamma, which came out in the let's see, I think it was the early 60s. Let me see, 1964. Yeah, Gamma, and you can actually get the illustration on the back without the text, so suitable for framing. So Bill Nolan was writing books and doing all these things, and he and Beaumont and George Clayton Johnson and all these guys were palling around, and then Beaumont wrote a novel called The Intruder about a rabble-rouser who goes down south to stir things up, stir up racial tensions. And in 1963, Roger Corman wrote and directed and produced this movie with a script by Beaumont called The Intruder. And it's a very fun movie. The only movie Roger Corman ever made that lost money. He tried slapping a number of titles on it, including I Hate Your Guts. Nothing worked. And this is Shatner before Star Trek, a few years before Star Trek. And Charles Beaumont actually plays the principal in this movie, the school principal, and Bill Nolan and George Clayton Johnson firebomb a church. They play redneck racists. And so if you want to see what they were like back in the early 60s, you can watch this movie, The Intruder, and you can see them firebombing a church, which is great fun. They really, really loved the role. And they were actually shooting this where the Klan was active. So they were essentially run out of town, and it was very dangerous shooting this movie. So it was because people were being lynched, churches were being firebombed. This stuff was happening, and right in the midst of the civil rights movement. So then Twilight Zone came to an end, and Beaumont was fading out, was dying, and ultimately was institutionalized. And George Clayton Johnson and Bill Nolan decided to write a novel together. And in my new book, Greenlighting Yourself, I talk about how you don't have to take what's given to you necessarily, or what's offered to you. You can set a high bar, and then you can pull it off if you're just very, very determined. It's what I've been doing with Space Command and a lot of the things I've done over my life, including the Twilight Zone companion. So Bill Nolan and George Clayton Johnson came up with an idea for a science fiction novel, but they didn't want. Now, at that time, there were several publishers who were specifically science fiction publishers, and they you might write a book and get $1,000, $3,000. It wasn't, the money was very, very, very paltry even back then in the early '60s. And so Bill Nolan and George Clayton Johnson decided to change the rules. And I want to read what Bill Nolan said about that. He said, working with fellow writer George Clayton Johnson in the summer of 1965, we got together the first draft of the novel. When I was a boy growing up in Kansas City, Missouri, our home phone number had been Logan 6466. We settled on Logan as a solid name for our hero. Our heroine's name, Jessica, came from a memorable young lady who had once posed for Playboy. I used my own middle name for the Sandman who pursues our two protagonists. We called him Francis. In alternate shifts, at the typewriter, we wrote the first draft in exactly 3 weeks, literally running with our characters, matching their run with the speed of the narrative itself. Johnson and I set a bold two-part goal for ourselves. We would bypass the usual science fiction publishers and sell the book to a top-line New York house, and then to Hollywood for the roundly satisfying sum of $100,000. Obviously, we had total faith in our project. Now, $100,000 was a huge amount of money in 1965. It'd be like $1 million today or more, and no science fiction writers were getting that kind of money. So it was a phenomenal goal, particularly for two writers who were relatively unknown. So he said. So Nolan continues. We found a West Coast agent who agreed to mass submit the book to 5 major publishers in New York. Result: Dial Press purchased hardcover book rights in February of 1966. Incidentally, the editor who said yes was E.L. Doctorow, who later left Dial to win world fame with Ragtime and other best-selling novels of his own. In October of that year, when the book was still in manuscript, a young independent producer named Stan Cantor apparently agreed to our film price, $10,000 down and $90,000 for the option pickup within 12 months. In the mid-'60s, this was a record sum for a science fiction property. Dell Books quickly purchased the first paperback rights, and Logan was off and running. And ultimately, what came of this was MGM picked up the movie. It went through a number of changes. Irwin Allen was going to produce it at one point, who did Lost in Space and all sorts of movies, including The Towering Inferno. And George Powell was going to produce it at one point and direct it. These fell through. But ultimately, MGM picked up the movie. Bill and George got their $100,000 and beyond. And the movie got cast and came out. And it was this, Logan's Run. And it starred Michael York and Jenny Agutter, and they were absolutely wonderful in it. And it's a funky movie. It's got some wacky stuff in it. It's a 1970s science fiction movie, but I love this film, and I love the heart that's in it, and it became a hit. It was a big hit. And thanks to that, and Richard Jordan was also in it as the villain, but this was a hit movie. It became a TV series, and then George and Bill decided they were going to sit down and write a sequel. So and that was an interesting journey. And by the way, here's another edition of Logan's Run, a more recent edition. I've got the first edition of both the paperback and the hardcover, but God knows where they are. And but Bill autographed this to me, and again, you can see more of his artwork. and again, this is just, but the point is, they succeeded, and this movie made their reputations, made their name. George could boast about Twilight Zone and Star Trek, but for Bill Nolan, bragging rights, despite the biographies he'd written, the anthologies he'd edited, such as A Sea of Space, that's another one of his books. There are many, many books that he worked on and wrote. Very prolific man. But so then they decided to sit down and write a sequel to Logan's Run, which would have been the natural thing. But something had happened in the interim, which is George Clayton Johnson, if you look at photos of him in The Twilight Zone Companion, etc., or if you look at him in The Intruder, he had short hair, and he wore a suit and tie, and he smoked cigarettes, tobacco cigarettes. But then the Surgeon General's report came out in the early '60s that tobacco could kill you, that could give you cancer and heart disease and all of these things. So George switched from cigarettes to marijuana, and he became a pothead, and he became a hippie. So he started growing his hair long, and in later years he would wear neon bright colors and have this long beard. And a wonderful man, a wonderful writer, but definitely Bill Nolan, who was still very straight-laced, and I think you can even probably tell in that photograph that this is far, far, far from being a hippie. When he and George sat down, they rented a trailer, and they were going to write the sequel, and they sat down, and George pulls out a handful of joints and drops them in the ashtray, And Bill Nolan says, "No, I'm out. We cannot work this way. This is not going to fly." And because they were basically like two ships that had kind of drifted apart, and so, but they saw the potential of Logan's Run. So first of all, they remained partners in the first novel. They fought for each other. Bill Nolan actually, when they weren't getting the royalties they deserved, he went after hammer and tongs with accounting, forensic accounting, and got the money that was owed to them by the publisher. Years later, this is in the 70s or 80s. And so they remained dear friends, but they couldn't write together. So they agreed to a very interesting decision, which was they would each write. They would continue to share Logan's Run as an IP, but they would each write and benefit from their own individual sequels. So, so George started working on a project that I think he called Jessica's Run, and I have the outline for his version. Now, they also, by the way, had written their own screenplay of Logan's Run when the novel was done, and that was bought by MGM, but that was not the version that was produced. And I haven't read that draft. I should, but Logan's Run, their novel, is available in print and also as an audio book, both abridged and unabridged. You can hear Bill Nolan read the abridged version, and but the book is really a delightful book, and but they decided to part ways, and yet each could write their own totally unrelated sequel to Logan's Run. Now, George spent many years outlining Jessica's Run, or whatever he ultimately called it, and I have the outline in amongst my files, but it never reached fruition. He never wrote the book. Maybe someday someone will, but Bill Nolan wrote Logan's World, and it made a lot of money as well. And if you look at the novelization or the movie tie-in edition of Logan's Run and Logan's World, you can see they're very, very much similar, and that's delivered, of course, to catch the fire, the heat of success, So that went on, and then later, in later years, Bill Nolan would publish a later edition of Logan's. This is the third book, Logan's World, and Bill did the cover, and again, the artwork is, what it is. and Bill signed this book to me. This probably, I think, was the last time I saw him, perhaps. He said, from Mark, who wrote a great book on the Twilight Zone, from his pal, Bill Nolan. And so that really warms my heart. Now Bill Nolan, of course, kept writing. He wrote this book, again signed to me, which is Space for Hire, which was a science fiction detective novel, where he created a character. We all know Dashiell Hammett's Sam Spade, so Bill created a character called Sam Space, and they had these science fiction adventures. And so what I'll say about Bill Nolan is he was not a great writer, but he wrote with gusto. He was enthusiastic. He was just a wonderful, wonderful man, a delightful man, an entertaining man. He had great stories to tell. He, Charles Beaumont, when he was at his prime, he was this astonishing man who made all other people around him better, work harder, work better, aim higher, and he would come up with these wild inspirations. For instance, at one point, he called Bill in the middle of the night and he said, "Hey, listen, would you want to go crash Princess Grace's inauguration, her wedding?" She was marrying Prince Rene in Monaco, and they just hopped a plane the next day and flew there and went to the party. And they had a great time. They hung out with Ian Fleming and went to all the Al Capone hotspots in Chicago. This was all Beaumont's doing, but these were wonderful memories that Bill Nolan had, because he would go with Beaumont. He would seize upon the moment, because he was didn't have kids, so he wasn't tied down in the way that people like Richard Matheson were. And Matheson, of course, was not as bold a spirit and as daring a spirit as Beaumont. Great writer, of course, but very different emotionally. So, but and then in later years, he also wrote more stories about Sam Space. So here's a hardcover of 7 for Space, which is short stories of Sam Space, and again, just wonderful. And this book actually has a preface by George Clayton Johnson about Bill Nolan, and they both signed the book, which was very, very dear. And so these are treasures and wonderful things that I love to have, and all of the memories, of course. But I just want to take a little time to let you know about Bill Nolan. If you want to check out any of his books, any of his work, I recommend it. He was a great guy, and thank God for Logan's Run, because those of us who write science fiction, we all hope that something we do will somehow be remembered, something we worked on, and if we're lucky, it's at least one thing. You know, Harlan Ellison, who is the great writer of City on the Edge of Forever and many other things, he never had that great novel that put him on the map. Like Ray Bradbury had Fahrenheit 451, and so Harlan, you know, I think struggled a lot more to be noticed in a way, particularly to live on beyond his own lifetime. But fortunately, Bill Nolan had Logan's Run, and from that you can find many of his other wonderful works, and just spend a little time with Bill Nolan. And again, thanks to the internet, you can look him up and see videos of him, I'm sure. And but I'm just so glad he took me under his wing when I was young and helped me find what I needed to find out about the Twilight Zone. And from then on, we were just, anytime we ran into each other at a convention or a signing, we would be just really, really glad to see each other. So 93 is a good long run. You know, George Clayton Johnson we lost a few years ago. Ray Bradbury we lost a few years ago. You know, these people, when they're gone, there's no replacement. They were unique, one of a kind, and very, very loved and very admired. And those of us who knew these people, we are blessed to have known them, and it's really great to have a way to share some of what we experienced with you. So we'll talk next time. Much more coming. And thanks, guys. And thanks for being there. Take care.